So remember the positive motivation we started with earlier today. Bring that back up in your mind and renew your aspiration to be of benefit to yourself, to others, to the world, and wish that we will learn something in this session that will help to bring that about. So during the break, I was thinking more about the question that came up this morning, the end of the session, about not being afraid of death, and wondering if when people have that idea, I'm not afraid of death, if it could be because of the ideas, the conceptions that one has about death, and what death is all about and what happens when we die. I think some people, probably many people nowadays, have the idea that dying is just like going to sleep, except that you don't wake up again. So they may have that idea. And most people aren't afraid of going to sleep, I think. We think of going to sleep as something nice and pleasant, just going into a state of unconsciousness. So if you think of death like that, well, you just go to sleep, but then that's it. Not waking up again, and then just going into oblivion, going into nothingness, becoming non-existent. I guess most of my life, as an adult, I've been with Buddhists in Buddhist communities, so I don't have too much contact with people who have other views, but I do hear about them. And I remember a couple of years ago, I think I watched this. It was like a dialogue between a scientist. I can't remember his name. I think he was a physicist, theoretical physicist or something, and he'd just written this best-selling book. So he was one person in this dialogue, and the other person was Alan Wallace. He was, in case you don't know, he's a long-term Buddhist. He's also a physicist. I mean, he also studied physics and incredible knowledge of many different things. But anyway, we're discussing consciousness. And this scientist was talking about how there's just nothing after death. There's no afterlife. And the way he said it was like absolute certainty. Like, we have proved it without a shadow of doubt. That's just how it is. You just have to accept it. That kind of attitude, like that's it. And he seemed so self-assured, so self-confident, so knowledgeable, so smart. And he's written all these books. And so, yeah, if people encounter that kind of person and that kind of view and that kind of book and so on, then, well, it's almost like scientists nowadays are the new religious leaders. Science is like a new religion, and they are the religious leaders. So a lot of people, maybe not everyone, but they just buy into it. They just believe it. He's a scientist. He must know what he's talking about. And then, of course, Alan Wallace gave another point of view. But anyway, so I was kind of, wow. So this is one thing to check. What is your conception about death and what death means? What happens when we die? According to Buddhism, death is the separation of our mind and our body. The body is left behind to be buried or cremated or composted or donated to a medical school. So there's different things you can do with the body. But anyway, it ends up transforming into something other than what we normally know as a body. The mind, according to Buddhism, is something that never dies, never goes out of existence. It carries on, it continues. It just leaves the body, separates from the body. And then it, as long as we're still ordinary beings, we haven't reached enlightenment or nirvana, then it will take another life, another rebirth. And the kind of rebirth it takes depends on our karma. Basically, there's good karma and bad karma. If you have a lot of bad karma, then the next life, next rebirth will be an unfortunate one. If you have more good karma, then the next life will be a nice one, fortunate one with good experiences. It's not a question of choice. I've heard there are people who do believe in rebirth or reincarnation, but they think we have a choice. We get to choose. After we die, we're in this place with beings around us, and we get to choose where we're going to go, what kind of rebirth we're going to take. So that sounds very nice, but that's not how it works according to Buddhism. It's our karma. The karma, that whatever karma is strongest, most prevalent and powerful, is what will propel us to the next life, to the next rebirth. And I also find that whole idea very strange anyway, because there's so many births in situations that are just horrific. Yeah, I mean, in a war zone or in a place like Yemen where there isn't enough food to eat, kids are starving, or into a family with where there's addiction, parents are addicted to heroin, maybe abusive, awful, awful stuff. So why would anyone choose such a rebirth if we really did have a choice? I mean, generally, if we have a choice, we choose something that's going to be pleasant, comfortable, nice. Yeah. So that's not how it is according to Buddhism. It's not a question of choice, it's a question of karma. So I'd like to read something from this book, one of the sutras. I won't read the whole thing because it would take too long, but I'll just read some of the words. And this is related to the topic that you did meditation on earlier today, on the inevitability of death, the certainty of death. So that's what the Buddha is talking about here. But he also does talk about how it's our karma that determines where we go after death. So I'll just tell the story. Buddha was in Sravasti, the Indian one, not here. One of his disciples was a king named Pasenadi, and King Pasenadi's grandmother had passed away, and he was stricken with grief. And after dealing with the cremation, he went to see the Buddha. The Buddha saw him, and I guess he had soiled clothes and disheveled hair. And so the Buddha asked him, why do you have this appearance? And the king told him that he had just cremated his grandmother. And the Buddha asked him if he had thoughts of love and esteem for his grandmother. And the king said, yes, very much so. And he also said that he would give everything he has, all the elephants, horses, and the 7 treasures in this country, even up to the country's dominion. He would give all of these away if he could just have his grandmother back. But then he said, but I am not able to do that. And that is why I feel so much grief and despair, and it's difficult to bear this on my own. And so it seemed like he was hoping for some words from the Buddha that would be helpful for him in this situation. So the Buddha then spoke to him about how death is something that happens to everyone, to all living beings. So I'll read those words. And so the Buddha said, Great King, it is like this, it is like this. All living beings, all insects, all who live, being born, will entirely pass away and come to expire in the end. Not a single one, being born, will not die. Great King, even those born in a great family of Brahmins, a great family of warriors, a great family of merchants, will all pass away. So those are the higher castes in Indian society, so the ones at the top of society. So they will all pass away. None will not die. Even a great head-anointed warrior king who holds the position of governing over the 4 continents and has gained unimpeded power over it without a single hostile country that has not been vanquished by him, in the final end will reach the ultimate limit and is not beyond passing away. Again, great king, one who is born among the devas of long life as their king in the heavenly palace with unimpeded enjoyment, will in the end also come to exhaustion and is not beyond passing away. Again, great king, Arhat. An Arhat is someone who has attained nirvana, liberation from samsara. Arhat monastics who have eradicated the influxes, left behind the heavy burdens, done what is to be done, reached their own benefit, eradicated all the fetters, whose minds are well liberated by right knowledge, they will also, in the end, come to exhaustion, abandon their bodies, and attain final nirvana. Again, Pacceka Buddhas, who are well tamed. So these are also another kind of arhats, another person who's attained nirvana, who are well tamed and well pacified with the exhaustion of their bodies and lives, will in the end come to attain final nirvana. Buddhas, blessed ones, who are endowed with the 10 powers and the 4 intrepidities, I think that's what we call the 4 fearlessnesses, having roared their supreme lion's roar. That's it's like an analogy for teaching the Dharma, will in the end abandon their bodies and attain final nirvana. In the same way as well, great king, it should be understood that all living beings, all insects, all who live, being born, will entirely pass away and come to be extinguished in the end. They are not beyond passing away. And then the Blessed One further spoke this poem. All types of living being alive, will in the end come to die. Each following their karmic destiny will receive their own good and evil fruits. Evildoers fall into hell. On account of wholesomeness, one ascends to heaven. Those who cultivate the most excellent path with influxes eradicated, that's another word for afflictions, having eliminated all the afflictive emotions, they attain final nirvana. A Tathagata and a Pacceka Buddha and the disciples of a Buddha share in common that they will abandon their bodies and lives. What to say of ordinary people? When the Buddha had spoken this discourse, hearing what the Buddha had said, King Pasenadi rejoiced in it and was delighted. He paid homage and left. So everyone has to die. Initially, we don't like to hear that. We don't like to think that. It's uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, maybe frightening as well. But in time, I mean, it's inevitable. I mean, it's just a fact of life. And if we can get familiar with it, get comfortable with it, come to accept it, then that itself will appease the fear and any other difficult emotions we may have about it, And then ideally one learns methods for living one's life in a way that's meaningful and beneficial and satisfying, keeping one's mind, as positive and peaceful as possible, as long as possible. And in that way, then the life passes well with as few problems as possible. And when the life comes to an end, one has a great chance of being in a positive state of mind. And then that's another important factor in determining where we go after we die. It's partly the karma we create during our life, but it's also partly the state of mind we have as we die. That's considered very, very important. Um, so the ideal in Buddhism and probably all other religions and spiritual traditions is to die with a positive state of mind, not with anger, hatred, with attachment, clinging, craving, with fear, any other kind of disturbing thoughts and emotions, but instead die with a positive state of mind. For example, faith, refuge in one's object of refuge. In Buddhism, that means faith in the Buddha, thinking of the Buddha, thinking of the three jewels, thinking of our teacher, and having faith in them, praying to them. Other alternatives would be compassion, loving kindness. I'll talk more about that tomorrow. Lama Zopa Rinpoche says that's the best state of mind to have at the time of death. Just thinking of all living beings and wanting to benefit them. And, whatever happens after death, next life, may I be in a position to be able to help others as much as possible. If we can actually have bodhicitta, I want to become a Buddha, fully enlightened being, to be able to help all living beings. So in my next life and in all my future lives, may I be in the right situation, the right conditions to be able to continue learning about the path, practicing the path, working towards enlightenment. So just feeling totally dedicated, committed to helping all living beings with love and compassion. So that's a fantastic state of mind to have at the time of death. So those are some examples, but the point is some kind of positive state of mind and not a negative state of mind. And to be able to do that, to be able to have such a positive state of mind as we die, we need to acquaint ourselves with positive states of mind as we live. And that's the whole purpose of practice, Dharma practice. It's training our mind and training our body and speech, our whole being, to be as positive as possible, virtuous as possible. And in that way, that's our natural way of being, our default mode. So then even when death comes, even if it happens suddenly, unexpectedly, like in a car crash or a plane crash or something like that, there's a greater chance that we'll be in a positive state of mind. And then this topic about rebirth, because as I started off saying that if you have the idea that death is just like going to sleep and then going into oblivion, becoming totally non-existent, maybe you don't feel so frightened about that idea. That isn't so scary. Although I did meet somebody once. I was teaching this course, and this man told me that he was terrified of the idea of going out of existence. That wasn't a pleasant idea for him. And so he really wanted to know what is the Buddhist explanation. So I told him. And most other religions, as far as I know, also speak of some kind of afterlife, even if they don't talk about rebirth or reincarnation. But there's something that continues after the body dies. This isn't all that there is, this physical body, this brain. There's more than that. But yeah, from what I've heard and read, many scientists and philosophers and just ordinary people don't like to believe that, don't want to believe that, or just aren't convinced of it. So many people do find the idea of rebirth or an afterlife challenging. It's definitely part of Buddhist teachings. So the Buddhist path, the Buddhist explanation does include this idea of multiple lives rather than just one single life. So if you do find it a difficult topic to deal with and difficult to believe in, I encourage you to not totally reject it, close your mind to it, but keep your mind open and explore. Because there's actually a lot of stories of people who can remember past lives, people who have memories of past lives, although it's easy to dismiss those as fantasies. But some of those stories, the person is able to give information that can be verified. There's this one story that's very interesting. There's a little boy born here in America. His name is James Leininger, something like that. And when he was 2 years old, he started having nightmares. He would wake up screaming and his parents would go in and he'd be saying something like, plane on fire, little man can't get out. And this was happening again and again, like several times a week. And the parents were quite concerned. They got in touch with this woman named Carol Bowman, who I've actually started reading a book of hers. Her own children remembered past lives, and she's done a lot of therapy work with children remembering past lives. So she encouraged them to ask this little boy for information, like, tell me more about this plane and who's this little man and so on. So they started asking him questions. And so he said, I'm the man. I'm the man in the plane. And why is the plane on fire? Because it was shot by the Japanese. Oh, so anyway, more and more information came out, and he had all this. He could remember his name. He was a pilot in the Second World War, American pilot, fighting the Japanese off the coast of Japan, and his plane was shot down and went down in the water. He could remember his name. He could remember the ship, the battle, aircraft carrier that they would take off and land on, and names of his fellow pilots, the type of plane that he flew, and that it was a lousy plane. What were they called? Corsairs. And they were really lousy. The wheels, something wrong with the wheels. And he just had all this information. And the parents are just like, where did he get all this stuff? He wasn't watching TV programs about World War II. And, he's just watching Teletubbies and Barney and all those kind of things. And the father started doing research and, looking up this stuff. And he found there really was an aircraft carrier. It was a Nakoma, I think. There really was an aircraft carrier by that name. There was a plane, Corsair, flying during World War II, and so on and so forth. He even found some of the names of his fellow pilots. These guys were still alive. Some of them were still alive, and they could remember this person. There was a guy named James. He also had the same name, James, who was 22 years old and was shot down, died in that battle. So all this stuff turned out to be true. And how did this little 2-year-old kid know it? So some skeptics said, oh, the parents just fed him this information and, got him to talk like this was who he was. Well, why would parents do such a thing? I mean, it didn't make any sense. So anyway, there are some stories like that where the person, it's usually a child, but sometimes an adult, the information they give can be checked and verified. And then it becomes very difficult to explain. You can't say that's just fantasy. It's true. It's something that really happened. So how did that information get into that person's mind or person's brain? So that's one thing to look into. memories of past lives. Another one is near-death experiences. This is when a person has often something like a heart attack, cardiac arrest, or a car accident, and their body, or sometimes it happens, they're in the emergency room or operating theater, and they, just kind of die for a period of time. Everything stops. And then after some time, they are revived or they come back. And during that period of time when they are like dead, they, not all people, but some people have conscious experiences, and sometimes they're extraordinary experiences. So there are researchers who have collected these, and some of these researchers themselves are doctors, so they're not like, people who don't know anything but doctors. And so that also becomes very difficult to explain, because if the brain is not functioning, if like some scientists say, consciousness, mind is simply produced by the brain. So if the brain is not functioning, the brain is like dead for a period of time, but the person is having experiences, where are those coming from? There's a book I found here in the library, and it's called Proof of Heaven. I don't know if any of you have read that. The author is named Ibn Alexander, and he's a neurosurgeon. So he himself knows all about the brain and has performed surgery on brains and so on. And he had the experience suddenly getting really, really sick and then going into a coma. I think they found it was some kind of very rare infection that got into his brain. It was just really weird what happened to him. Very unusual. And he was in a coma for about a week. The doctors were trying to, help him, and they didn't know how, and it was just getting worse and worse, like his brain was getting more and more damaged. And finally, it was after a couple of days, they said, even if he survives, the damage to his brain is such that he'll just be a vegetable for the rest of his life. So they were trying to decide whether to pull the plug. And anyway, he did come out of his coma after 7 days. And during those 7 days, he had these extraordinary experiences, like going to this amazing world, which was just so beautiful and wonderful, and having experiences with this kind of presence that, being a Christian, he thought of as God. Although the interesting thing was, when he came out of, back to consciousness, he would use the word Om to refer to this presence. I mean, that word was actually happening while he was there, encountering this presence. The word Om came up. Very interesting. But anyway, the book is quite interesting because, being a scientist, being knowledgeable about the brain, he posited possible explanations of what caused these experiences. Could it be something in the brain? And he said the state his brain was in, he has all the medical records, the state his brain was in, there's no way that damaged brain could have produced those experiences. And another interesting thing, kind of makes goose pimples, just to tell his own life story. He had been adopted. His biological parents were teenagers, very, very young when he was born. And the law in his state at that point in time was the mother was not allowed to keep the baby. He had to be given up for adoption. So he was adopted, brought up by another family, and it was all very wonderful. And it was, he learned later that he had been adopted and tried to get in touch with his birth or his biological parents. And at first they were reluctant, but later he did manage to meet them and get to know them. And they had gotten married, and then they had more kids. So he actually had some siblings from his biological parents. But there was also one child who was a sibling of his who had died. So he never met her. He only knew her name. He'd never even seen a photograph of her. So that's one bit of story. And then when he was in this near death, I don't know what to call it, during the time when he was in a coma and in this other world and having these other adventures, there was this girl that he met, and he had a very vivid recollection of what she looked like, how she was dressed, and so on. He met her a number of times because she accompanied him on some journeys. And then after he came out of the coma and was readjusting to his life and so on, at some point he received a photograph of his deceased sister, the one he had never met before, from his biological family. And he looked at that photograph and he recognized that was the girl he met. So again, skeptics would probably say, oh, it's just a coincidence, or no, he really did see a photo and he just forgot about her, and then his mind. Anyway, so probably not enough to convince skeptics. But for him, he was convinced. It just really opened his mind up to, yeah, there's much more than just this body, this physical body. So there's things like that you can look into. I wouldn't go so far as to say that everyone who claims to remember a past life or everyone who claims to have some kind of out-of-body experience is genuine. There might be people who fantasize, who have fantasies, or just making stories up to get attention. It's possible. But many of these stories to me seem quite convincing. I suggest that you just try to keep your mind open to the possibility that there is something more than just this life, this body. Maybe one day the scientists will actually come up with proof for it. Who knows? And this is one problem. People ask, well, where's the proof? Where's the proof for rebirth, for reincarnation? But the problem with that is proof, scientific proof, is usually physical. The scientific instruments and so on deal with physical phenomena, things that are made of cells and molecules and atoms and so on. Whereas the mind, the consciousness, according to Buddhism, is not physical. It's not a physical thing. It's non-material. So there are no instruments so far. Maybe one day they will find one, but no instrument so far that's able to detect the presence of something that's not physical. So that's the kind of evidence people want to feel absolutely confident that there's rebirth. But I don't know if that kind of evidence will ever be possible. Let's say, Bill.
Dr. Ian Stevenson and his predecessor, Dr. Jim Tucker, have looked through thousands of cases and have pulled out the ones that were airtight in terms of their research and investigating them for accuracy. And they've pulled out 2,500 of them that they feel confident to say that they have evidence towards the fact that at least some people remember their past lives. And so you can look up Dr. Jim Tucker and reincarnation on the internet and find him saying these words. It was very interesting. He also mentioned that with a lot of things that we take as fact, like the fact that medicines work, no medicine is 100% effective. They have evidence that it helps. So it's in keeping with other scientific research and validity that's already available.
Yeah, so that's another source of information. Ian Stevenson, who spent something like 40 years researching cases of people remembering past lives. And then his work has been carried on by his colleague, Jim Tucker. I think they were both at the University of Virginia, both professors. And actually, another thing they have been researching is birthmarks. So there seems to be cases where a birthmark on a person relates to some event in a previous life, like if they'd been shot with a bullet. In the next life, they may have a birthmark in that part of the body. And I mentioned Carol Bowman, who did a lot of work with children. Her son, when he was 5 years old, just started getting really scared of loud noises. Like on the 4th of July, there were fireworks going off, and he just got terrified and started crying. He hadn't shown that kind of fear before, but all of a sudden it started when he was 5. She knew somebody who was a hypnotherapist, and that person happened to be in the house. So they decided to, try it on the little boy. And he remembered being a soldier in the Civil War, in a battle, all this fighting, shooting, cannons, and so on going on. And so he had very vivid memories of that. And at one point, he was kind of behind a boulder with his gun shooting and getting shot at. He got a bullet in his wrist, in his right wrist, and had to go and get that bandaged. And then they sent him back into the battlefield. In this present life, he had eczema, I think, and in that part of the wrist. He'd had it since he was a very small child, and nothing worked to clear it away. Just wouldn't go away. But after this memory, when he remembered that experience, the eczema went away. Interesting. So that's another thing. Again, a skeptic would just say, oh, it's just a coincidence. But if these birthmarks, like in his case, if they actually clear up or go away, there's just a lot of things that science can't explain. It's not 100% accurate about everything. So anyway, just try to keep an open mind. And with regard to death and preparing for death, I think that whether you believe in another life after this one or that that's just the end of everything, it still makes sense to prepare for death, because I'm sure nobody would want to die in a bad state of mind. Freaked out, frightened, angry, clinging, unhappy. Yeah, that's not a nice state of mind to have at the time of death. So if we prepare ourselves during our life, acquaint ourselves with positive states of mind, an ethical, constructive way of living our life, learning to be more kind and compassionate and so on, then there's a greater chance that when the end of life comes, we'll be in a good state of mind as opposed to something unpleasant and negative. So there was a question that came in this morning. How does one prepare for death? And then there's this term that I'd never encountered before, Maranasati meditation. So I looked it up, and it means death awareness meditation. That's the Pali term, Maranasati meditation. And it seems that, different traditions would have different ways of practicing it. I'm mainly familiar with the 9-point meditation on death, which is the one we have in the Lam Rim. And you did the first part of that this morning, right? The certainty of the time of death. The main points you think about in that meditation are, death is definite. I'm definitely going to die. So you really try to get that clear in your mind. And then you go on to think about the uncertainty of the time of death. That's the second main point. And I thought maybe tomorrow morning you can meditate on that, whoever's leading that. That's really powerful, because even if we accept that we're going to die, our sense may be that it's far away. It's not going to happen anytime soon. Like, oh, I'm still young, so I don't have to think about death now. Or I'm healthy, I don't have to think about death now. It's sick people and old people who think about death, but not me. But that's not realistic, because you don't have to be old and you don't have to be sick to die. Young people die and healthy people die, because there's many causes of death, many different ways that death can happen, and some of these can happen just very suddenly out of the blue. Yeah, very uncertain how long we have to live. And then after contemplating that, hopefully we'll get some sense that, oh, so, death could happen anytime. What do I do? How can I prepare for it? And then that leads to the third of the three main points, which is, looking at what helps at the time of death. What's going to help me at that moment when I'm facing my death, the end of my life? That we'll look at that more tomorrow. But ideally, the conclusion is that you see the value, the importance of practicing Dharma, doing some practice of Dharma, some kind of spiritual practice, which can vary from one person to another, but some kind of practice or training that will enable us to have a positive state of mind rather than a negative one, overwhelmed with fear or other disturbing emotions. So find some kind of practice and start training now to be familiar with it so that you can bring that up. That will come up in your mind even if death happens suddenly. So that is the way of meditating on death or having death awareness in the Tibetan tradition. I'm not so familiar with other traditions, how they would do it, but I was thinking that if you just have the thought, I'm going to die, and acquaint yourself with that, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, it doesn't necessarily lead to a positive conclusion or positive way of living your life. For example, the Epicureans, they seem to be quite aware that, uh, they were going to die, and they ended up thinking, eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow you will die. So, and that could happen, just spontaneously to people. Well, yeah, I'm not going to live forever, so I better do all those things that I want to do, like the bucket list. People make this bucket list, and I got to make sure I do all those things before I die. And they're mostly just things to do with pleasure, enjoyment, excitement, thrills, So just thinking about death and having awareness of our mortality won't necessarily lead us to spiritual teachings or spiritual practice. The Buddhist way of awareness of death should be done in the context of the Buddhist view of this is just one life that we have. When this life ends, we'll go to another one. What that life will be, the circumstances of that life, depend on how we live this life. Not just a question of chance, it's not a question of choice, but we are creating our own future by the way that we live our life now. And if we want good experiences, be in a good situation, it's up to us. It's our responsibility to do the things that will bring that about. And if we don't want bad things happening to us, like hell, hungry ghost, being a hungry ghost, or even being born as a human being but in a really, really terrible situation, that's up to us to make sure we don't create the causes for that kind of situation. So this is the purpose of having awareness of death in the Buddhist tradition, is it impels us to see the value of spiritual practice and making sure that we find time to do spiritual practice while we still have time left. We don't know how much time we have left. So I'll talk more tomorrow about different practices that we can do that will help us at the time of death and also help us during our life. Because that's the thing, preparing for death isn't life denying, isn't denying yourself happiness and pleasure. Because if we live our life with an awareness that we're going to die and use that awareness to live our life well, then this life will go better. This life will be a good one, a positive one, because we'll be doing things that feel right, that feel good, that we feel I'm doing the right thing, and not having regret and guilt and worry and disconnection between what we feel is right and what we're actually doing. So we'll feel good about the way we live our life. And our relationships with other people will go well too, because we'll be acting in ways that are kind and helpful and considerate, ethical, not being mean and nasty and manipulative and lying and cheating and so on. So our connections with others will go well as well. So living our life in preparation for death is a good way to live life, bringing real peace and happiness and satisfaction here and now, in addition to being able to die with a good state of mind. Okay, so I wanted to do something else this afternoon. Another kind of fear, this morning I was talking about fear. Another kind of fear that we may have with regard to death would be fear of sickness and pain. Now, not everybody may experience sickness and pain while they're dying, but it does happen. There's a good chance that we will face those experiences. So it's good to be prepared for that and know how to manage them. And according to Buddhism, it's perfectly fine to seek medical help and take medication for sickness and pain. Some people seem to have the idea that if you're a Buddhist, you just have to meditate and deal with everything through meditation. But that's not only meditation, no medication. That's not true. But on the other hand, medication doesn't always work. I met somebody who worked in a pain clinic, and this person was actually a psychologist, and I was kind of curious why a psychologist is working in a pain clinic. And he said, "Well, pain medication doesn't always work. In fact, it only works." I was surprised by this. He said it only works for about 30% of people. For 30% of cases of chronic pain get relief from medication using psychological methods, or meditation are often used to help people deal with pain. The medication doesn't work, so it is useful to know how to deal with our mind, not just think, oh, I'll just take a painkiller and it'll go away. So there's a nice story in here, the chapter called Sick Body and Healthy Mind. So I won't read the whole thing, but just read parts of it. There's a disciple of the Buddha, a layman whose name is Nakula, and he's 120 years old. And his body is weak and suffering from disease. He longs to see the Buddha and his monks, who are his good friends. So he goes to where the Buddha is staying, a place called Sumsumaragira. I never heard of before. And then approaches the Buddha, pays respects, and asks for a teaching that will be for his peace for a long time. So the Buddha commends him for coming, even though he's so old and he's weak and he's ill. And then he says, "Householder, you should know when the body is suffering from disease, you should constantly train so that the mind does not suffer from disease." And then he became silent. So Nakula rejoiced and was delighted at what the Buddha said, paid his respects, and left. And Shariputra was sitting under a tree not far away, and Nakula approached him and paid his respect. And Shariputra commented that Nakula looked joyfully relaxed, and his complexion was bright. And he asks if he had heard a profound teaching from the Buddha. And Nakula said yes. The Buddha gave him a teaching, and he felt as if his body and mind were anointed with the ambrosia of the Dharma. And he told Shariputra what the Buddha had said to him. "Householder, you should know when the body is suffering from disease, you should constantly train so that the mind does not suffer from disease." And then Shariputra asked, "Did you ask the Buddha how to do this?" And Nakula said, "That's why I came to you. I'm hoping you can explain this to me." So Shariputra said, "Okay." And then he proceeded to give an explanation. The explanation is a little bit long, so I'll read some of it. So Shariputra is explaining, how can you have a sick body but not a sick mind, a healthy mind? But he starts by talking about what it means to have a sick body and a sick mind. So he says, a foolish, unlearned worldling does not understand as it really is the arising of bodily form, the cessation of bodily form, the gratification in bodily form, the danger in bodily form, and the escape from bodily form. Because of not understanding it as it really is, the worldling craves with delight for bodily form, declaring bodily form to be the self or to belong to the self, clinging and holding and taking hold of it. So this is what we tend to do. We tend to feel this body is me, or it belongs to me. The I is something that owns this body. So we're kind of strongly attached to and identified with the body. And then he goes on, if bodily form is ruined, if it becomes otherwise, the foolish, unlearned worldling's mind and consciousness follow it in turn, giving rise to vexation and pain. Vexation and pain having arisen, the foolish, unlearned worldling is frightened, obstructed, worried, distressed, and passionately bound. So, in following the sutra, Bhikkhu Analayo gives a little bit of explanation. So, this term foolish, unlearned, worldly person is someone who is not acquainted with the liberating teachings as given by the Buddha. And it's a person who lacks the means to acquire true wisdom. So such a person remains immersed in ignorance and reacts foolishly when confronted with the vicissitudes of life. So, for example, believing the body is the self, what belongs to the self, and then seeking gratification of our senses, wanting pleasant experiences, visual and hearing sounds, smells, tastes, and bodily sensations. So always chasing after pleasant experiences with our senses, but not understanding the impermanent nature of all of these things. Our body is impermanent, and all these pleasant experiences are impermanent, and so on. Not understanding that, and then getting upset when pleasure disappears and unpleasant things occur. So this is the situation of a ordinary worldling, worldly person. And then Shariputra goes on to repeat the same kind of refrain with regard to the other four aggregates: feelings, discriminations. What's the fourth one? It's sometimes called compositional factors, miscellaneous factors. Yeah, a big bag of things. And then consciousness. So this is the Buddhist explanation of a person, a being, these 5 different aggregates. But we can condense it into body and mind, basically. It's body and mind. So we tend to identify and get attached to our body and to our mind, the different aspects of our mind, and believe this is me, or this is what belongs to me, and having a lot of attachment, always running after pleasure, getting upset when it disappears, and so on and so forth. So people in this kind of situation are those who, when the body is sick, the mind also gets sick. Both body and mind are diseased. And then he goes on to explain the opposite. A learned, noble disciple, that's probably an Arya, my guess is an Arya. So an Arya, way up there, an Arya is someone who's had a direct realization of emptiness, so they know things as they are. They're no longer fooled by thinking there is a self to be found somewhere in this body-mind combination. They understand the impermanent nature of all of this and selflessness, emptiness, and so on. So they're no longer um, seeking for or expecting pleasure, permanent pleasure to be found in our body and mind. A learned, noble disciple understands as it really is the arising of bodily form, the cessation of bodily form, the gratification in bodily form, the danger in bodily form, and the escape from bodily form. Having understood it as it really is, the learned, noble disciple does not give rise to craving and delight, seeing bodily form as the self or belonging to the self. If bodily form changes, if it becomes otherwise, the learned, noble disciple's mind does not follow it in turn, giving rise to vexation and pain. The mind not having followed it in turn and given rise to vexation and pain, the learned, noble disciple does not get frightened, obstructed, worried, distressed, and passionately bound. And he goes on to repeat the same with the other aggregates, feelings, and so on. So that's what it means to have a mind that is able to not be sick, even when the body is sick. So this is, quite a high achievement. um, and we may not be there yet. I know I'm not. But we can still train ourselves to go in that direction. And even training ourselves to do so will be very helpful. So at the end of this chapter, Bhikkhu Anulayo gives some advice on how we can start working in that direction. So first he talks about how disciples, practitioners, are able to start practicing. Disciples who have become learned through receiving instructions comparable to those given in the present case to Nakula are able to ennoble themselves by cultivating wisdom and emerging from the foolishness caused by ignorance. In particular, they learn to see clearly that body, feeling, perception, formations, that's the fourth aggregate, and consciousness are impermanent phenomena. They're all subject to change. They are changing moment by moment, and they're not going to last forever. Therefore, the gratification they can provide, our body and mind, the gratification they can provide comes inexorably bound to the danger of clinging and attachment, resulting in dukkha once conditions change and become otherwise. The resultant understanding is the fertile soil within which freedom from attachment and a lessening of identification can grow, leading to the ability to remain with a healthily non-attached mind, even when experiencing strong pain and serious disease. So if we just familiarize ourselves with the truth of impermanence and the fact that we cannot find lasting pleasure, satisfaction in our aggregates, our body and mind, not expecting that anymore and just expecting that they are going to change and get older and sick and eventually die. Just getting more familiar with those will help us to be more accepting when changes do happen. And he goes on to say, in practical terms, when strong pain arises, instead of succumbing to the natural tendency to own this as mine, giving rise to all sorts of apprehensions about what this pain is doing to me now and going to do to my future, one might just try to be aware of the fluctuating physical sensations of pain. By remaining in present moment awareness of painful sensations without appropriating them as mine and reacting to them mentally, much of the mental affliction caused by physical pain can be avoided. This is how the mind can gradually learn not to suffer along with the body. So there's actually a very nice meditation, although it's not so much a meditation, but it's more like a Well, it can be a meditation. In the book Mindfulness in Plain English by Bhante Gunaratana, it's about mindfulness, but in one part of the book, he gives antidotes to different problems that can arise when meditating. And so he gives this method for dealing with pain, with physical pain. And I was thinking maybe we could just try it now together. So you might be experiencing some physical pain, or it doesn't have to be pain, it could just be some discomfort in your body. If you're not experiencing anything physically painful or uncomfortable, maybe there's something mental or psychological, because he says you can use this as well with mental pain, with like feelings of depression or whatever. So I'll ask you to focus on an area, either in the body or in the mind, of pain or discomfort. And then we'll just try to do this practice with it. It's very helpful. So make yourselves comfortable. Then bring your awareness, your attention to that place of pain or discomfort, either in your body or in your mind. And notice how your mind reacts to this discomfort. Try to notice if there's fear, aversion, maybe a sense of hopelessness, despair, that this is something that's going to be there forever, it will never go away. Whatever. What does your mind think or feel with regard to this unpleasant experience? So if we do have fear or aversion towards pain, then that causes us to want to avoid it and not go into it and explore it and understand it better. So that's what he's advising us to do here, to go into this pain or this discomfort and explore it. He says one thing we might notice is a kind of physical reaction to the pain. If it is physical pain, that area, the muscles around that area might tense up, might be tense, and that actually increases the pain rather than decreasing it. This is kind of a physical resistance. So he says it's good to focus on that area and then consciously, mentally relax the muscles around that area of pain or discomfort. So take them one by one and relax each one very thoroughly. And if you can do that, you might notice that the pain will diminish. And then he says there may also be mental resistance to the pain. He says just as you are tensing physically, you may also be tensing psychologically, clamping down mentally on the sensation of pain, trying to screen it off and reject it from consciousness. It's a kind of reaction like, I don't like this. I don't want this. I want it to go away. So see if you can notice that kind of reaction, mental or psychological aversion, rejection. And if you're able to locate that, see if you can relax that. Might be helpful just to remind yourself that pain is just a sensation, an experience. It's temporary, transitory, not permanent. So it's not something to be afraid of or have aversion towards. And he says, see if you can overcome this resistance and be able to go right down into the raw sensation that's there. Just go right into the place of pain or discomfort and let your mind, your awareness merge with it. Watch it ebb and flow. Notice what's actually there, what is actually happening. Try not to call it pain, but just see it as sensations. And maybe you'll notice there's different sensations coming and going. Maybe some are painful, some are not. Just try to observe, be with those sensations just as they are. So he says that what can happen if you do this is that it no longer hurts. Suffering is gone. Only the pain remains an experience, nothing more. The me who is being hurt has gone. The result is freedom from pain. So you can come out of the meditation, open your eyes. So he actually prefaces this by saying, if there are things you can do on the physical level to deal with pain, you can certainly do those things, like find a different position, a different way of sitting, take pain medication, wear looser clothes. So try to deal with the pain in those ways. But if it's still there, if it still happens, then this is something you can do in a meditative way. And it needs to be done in a gentle way. He says there's no masochism being advocated here. Self-mortification is not the point. This is an exercise in awareness, not self-torture. If the pain becomes excruciating, go ahead and move, but move slowly and mindfully. So this is something that could be done like when sitting, when doing meditation, and there's pain in the body. Our initial reaction is moving and getting away from that pain, getting to another position that isn't painful. But there is this tradition in mainly in Vipassana, mindfulness meditation circles, of just sitting with the pain, sitting through it, and dealing with it on the mental level rather than just moving all the time. And it can be very effective. So if we gain experience in this practice, then it enables us to deal with pain in a better way, and then that becomes helpful if and when we do find ourselves feeling greater pain, like through sickness or in the process of dying. So it's good to learn how to deal with pain with our mind, and there's lots of methods in the Buddhist tradition for how to do that. Are there any questions?
Someone is asking, isn't rebirth different from reincarnation? Aren't we taught that Buddhists believe in rebirth, but Tibetan Buddhism speaks of reincarnation a lot?
Yeah, I never quite understood that. There's some people who differentiate those two terms, rebirth and reincarnation, and say that one exists and the other doesn't. But I never understood that explanation. Does anyone else know? We just use those two words interchangeably. Perhaps the idea is one of the terms, for some people, one of those terms, I can't remember which one, seems to imply a soul or something that is reborn. But if you really understand the Buddhist explanation of things, it's definitely not the case. We're not talking about a soul like in Hinduism and Abrahamic religions talk about a soul that either goes to heaven or to hell. So Buddhism definitely doesn't agree with that. There's no fixed permanent soul that goes from one life to the next. It's our mind, our consciousness that passes from one life to the next. And that's not a soul because it's impermanent, for one thing. It's constantly changing. It's not a fixed identity, as the idea of a soul seems to imply. There was just this constantly changing, impermanent phenomena of mind, consciousness, a mental continuum. Actually, they use the term mental continuum, I think, to make it clear that it's like a river. It's something that flows and changes rather than a fixed thing that goes from one life to the next. So, I mean, to me, the term that's used doesn't really matter so much, but I know for some people they do make that distinction. So I'll just briefly explain the next part of the meditation, the 9-point meditation on death, and then tomorrow morning, Venerable Longsa will lead that meditation. So the main point, the main topic is the uncertainty of the time of death. So the point is to get a sense that death isn't necessarily far away from us. It actually could happen at any time. And there are 3 kind of subpoints or reasons to contemplate. One is that our life expectancy is uncertain. It's not certain how long human beings have to live. It isn't that we are guaranteed a certain number of years of life and everyone reaches that point and then they die. So there's no such thing. We die at all different times. And it's good to think of examples of that. Sometimes babies die, toddlers die, little kids die, teenagers die, people in their 20s die, and so on. So some people live a long life, 80s, 90s, or even over 100. But many don't. Many die right after they're born or even before they're born. So there's great variation in the length of time human beings have. And so that that means it's uncertain. When I look at myself, I just turned 69, which is kind of amazing. Hard to believe. But anyway, it always seems like the longer I live, the more I feel like, well, I'm not going to die anytime soon because I've lived so long already. You just keep waking up morning after morning, and then month after month and year after year. It's like you just kind of expect that it's going to keep going like this. It's almost like when I was younger, I was much more aware of the fragility of life. But yeah, but on the other hand, you know that there's definitely a ceiling. I think the longest people manage to live are maybe 115, 120. Very few people live that long, but some do. But that's really like the maximum. So it's getting closer. I'm getting closer to that time, definitely. And then another factor, another reason is there are many causes of death. So lots of different ways that death happens. So it's very interesting to think about that. Because different kinds of illness, but regardless of illness, there's so many other things that can happen. Accidents. Like I was saying the other day, sometimes people just die in their sleep. This happens often with babies. They call it sudden death syndrome, cot death. Sudden infant death. Anyway, but it's sudden adult death too. It can happen to adults. Just dying in your sleep without any apparent reason or cause. Quite extraordinary. So even when we go to sleep at night or take a nap in the day, in the afternoon, not definite that we're going to wake up again. So it's good to bring to mind actual examples of different ways that people die. And then some of those things could happen to me. Even meditation. Even doing meditation, you feel kind of safe sitting in meditation, like what could happen here? But I know one case, I heard of one case of a woman who died in meditation, but she did have a heart problem. So there was that. I don't think meditation itself can kill you, but something else could happen while you're meditating that could be the cause of death. And then the third point is that our life is just very fragile. It may seem as if we're strong and invincible and full of energy and we can do all these things with our body, but it doesn't take much. I mean, just look at COVID. It's so tiny, you can't see it with the eye. This teeny weeny little microscopic virus. But if we happen to inhale it, or touch it, something that has it, and then we touch our mouth, it gets into our system and wipes us out. Not everybody, but it can. The potential is there to be wiped out. Our life ended by this tiny little microscopic virus. So life, our body, our life is not that strong as we may think. It's actually quite fragile. So anyway, those are the main points, and Wamsel will add more to that, more thoughts to think about. And the conclusion from thinking about these points, the ideal conclusion, is that if we do see the value of practicing Dharma, working on our minds, getting our minds ready for death, to be able to have a positive state of mind at the time of death, we shouldn't postpone doing that work. That does sometimes happen. People think, well, right now I've got so many things to do. I should, take care of my kids and my career and my job and pay off all my bills and all these other things I have to do. And then later, when I'm older, I'll practice Dharma. So that's dangerous because we just don't know how long we have to live. So we should at least start doing something now, even in the middle of your normal life. As a working person, as a parent, you can still start doing some practice.